a bit of a technical difficulty, but we have got it figured out. So thank you for being here. We will give everybody just a second to get settled. Lawrence, are you walking the streets of Chicago?
Oh, sorry, I didn't know that you guys, I thought it was webinar. Yeah, I'm walking back home from dinner.
I love it. I love it.
Hello.
Okay. We'll give everybody just a second. And if you would like to go ahead and mute yourself, if you are on video or via phone, just so we can reduce feedback, that would be great. Okay. Well, we will go ahead and get started. And if folks keep entering, I think Taylor will help us navigate that, getting more folks into the space. So thank you everybody for being here tonight. We are having a conversation this evening about social responsibility and a call to action. My name is Christina Parle, and I am the Director of Chapter Services and Conduct. I have been with ZBT for almost a year and a half now, and am really excited to be here with you all tonight to talk about this, as it feels extremely needed given where we are as a country, and we will talk about all of those things. So please, please, please do not hesitate to drop questions in the chat function. Taylor, do we have the chat function, just to be clear?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great, awesome. And so feel free to drop questions or to unmute yourself and ask a question. All of that is fine. I think we have a good sized group to be able to have discussion as needed. So we've got some more people joining us. For those who are joining us, please feel free to have your video on, not have your video on, totally up to you. And yourself if you are able, so we can reduce feedback. But thank you everybody again for being here. And we would also like to thank the foundation for making ZBT from home a possibility for our undergraduate and alumni brothers to be able to have conversations like this throughout the summer, and hopefully, as we continue, especially, not always knowing what's going to happen with the fall semester on all of our campuses. So we'd really like to start this conversation by talking about expectations. I will do a lot of the talking, but there will be opportunities for us to do breakout sessions as well. And so you will be going into breakout sessions with the different individuals who are on this call. And so some of the expectations that we have is that you'd be present, right? Being on video is not easy. You are distracted by a lot of things, whether that's your email or your phone or somebody in the background or an animal. That's usually mine. I'm always distracted by my dog, but be present. Try to be as present as able, and then to actively listen. This topic isn't particularly easy for everybody to engage in, and so as much as you can actively listen, if you have a thought and you want to write it down so you can, re-engage and listen, making sure that we're listening to understand and not just listening to share our thoughts. And then next, be vulnerable and honest. This conversation is not particularly easy, especially when we have to reflect on things that we've done in the past, or things we've seen and not interrupted or disrupted, or things we've seen in our chapter or whatever it may be. So really being vulnerable and honest enough to have a conversation that will really help with your growth. And then participate. So similar to being present, also participate. I don't expect that everybody's a talker, but also if you can drop information in the chat, drop your thoughts in the chat. I'm doing as much participating as you're able. And then post this program, we really want you to focus on doing your own self-work in regards to social responsibility and how you show up for other people. So really thinking about how can I be working on myself and those around me in order to create a better environment for everyone. And then lastly, action. We will talk a lot about it and how you can be active as individuals, both at the chapter level and then as your individual selves. And so being really thoughtful about that. So again, if you've got questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. If you are just joining us, please feel free to mute yourself so we can reduce sound. Taylor, if there is a question, if you could just let me know, the chat function isn't showing up on my end. So moving on from here, we are in a crisis to some extent, right? Whether it is the global pandemic that we're experiencing or the civil unrest that we are experiencing as a nation. And so police brutality, although not new, is getting a lot of media attention right now. And that is causing a lot of civil unrest across the country. There's been a lot of conversations about looting and rioting and the burning of buildings and all of those things. And so that constitutes a crisis for a lot of us. A lot of us are worried about our homes, our families, our communities, and what that may look like. So thinking about it through that lens, there's also a lot of laws and policies that are being challenged right now, right? We're seeing chiefs of police step down. We're seeing policies and laws be quickly changed within the police environment. And so there's conversations about defunding the police, and there are conversations about how we're going to bring in more community workers. All of those things are happening amidst the global pandemic that we're all in as well, and that is impacting our daily life. Additionally, we've got a bit of a polarization within our leadership. So an individual who registered for this event talked about how do we manage this with a bipartisan government that isn't really willing to agree, right? And so that is real, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but really thinking about that polarization. What's currently going on, we have really made into a political issue. And the reality is, in some ways, it is, because our bipartisan government tends to fall on different sides in some ways. But I really want to challenge everybody to think about this as a human rights issue. People are hurting, and so we really want to think about that from a human perspective rather than just a political perspective. So when I talked earlier about the police brutality, one of the things that I mentioned is this is not new. And so want to talk a little bit about how we got here, because I think that that's particularly important for setting us up well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the harm that's been done. Okay, so when we think about slavery and the things that occurred at that point in our history, that started according to historians in 1619 with the kidnapping and purchasing of African people and selling of humans here in the United States. If you're not familiar with the transatlantic slave trade, that is a really great starting point of some education to do, where about 10 to 15 million Africans were traded between, across the Atlantic to the United States. One of the important things to note is that the Emancipation Proclamation, right, occurred in 1862, but didn't actually go into effect until the beginning of 1863. A lot of people are talking about this concept of Juneteenth, and everybody's like, wait, what is this? What does that mean? And I'm so happy to share it with you now because we're getting ready to be able to celebrate it on Friday. But Juneteenth is actually when, Black folks would say was the true freeing of slaves, right? So Juneteenth was June 19th of 1865 when the Civil War ended and the soldiers showed up in Galveston, Texas and read the Emancipation Proclamation to Black folks to share that they were freed, right? Because the North had won, and that's kind of where the Juneteenth celebration comes from. And so if you're seeing that information, that is where that is. The next thing that I really want to talk about is, we really went directly from slavery into what we really call like a lynching era. And that's really important because I think a lot of folks believe that once slavery was over, it was kind of done. And the reality is that slavery continued for some time. People or Black folks who didn't own property, nor did they have a white person to speak on their behalf, continued to be enslaved as well as lynched. So then once we move through that era, we get into the Jim Crow era. What is really important to note about Jim Crow is that those were true laws, right? And for those of us who are more familiar, the examples of that would be the different water fountains, different bathrooms, Black folks having to get food from the back of a restaurant or not being able to get food from a restaurant at all. Interracial marriage being illegal, white nurses not being allowed to be in the same space as a Black man, separate schools, white schools and Black schools not being able to interchange their books, things like that. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about Jim Crow. And then you have the Civil Rights Act that is ushered in 1964 and ends the Jim Crow laws. For those of you who are familiar with the book, The New Jim Crow, effectively, those Jim Crow laws became what we now call mass incarceration. just prior to that was the assassination of Martin Luther King. A lot of folks, use Martin Luther King as a way to really fall on one side of the argument or the other. But the reality is he too was assassinated in 1968 because of this movement. And so we moved from his assassination into mass incarceration of especially young Black men. A lot of statistics will show you that a significant amount of young Black men weren't even able to make it to their 18th birthdays before they ended up in the system of some sort. And so we get there, and the reality is the reason why a lot of people call it systemic racism is because it infected everything, right? The mass incarceration, the voting, housing, education, healthcare, and discrimination in hiring, which we're still talking about today in some regards. Then if we think a little bit about, the Rodney King beating that occurred March 3rd of 1991, that was a huge police brutality concern. Not a whole lot of things changed from that time, but that is a big turning point in history of something that a lot of people remember. Rodney King did not pass away in that situation. He passed away in 2012. And there is a lot of information out there about his situation, including, I believe it's called LA 92 on Netflix. So if you're interested in learning more about the incident that Rodney King was involved in, please feel free to do that. And then you have Trayvon Martin. That was a really pivotal incident that happened in regards to police brutality, that happened in regards to young Black men being killed. Of course, he was killed by George Zimmerman, who was an everyday citizen. And so that, again, occurred. Not a lot of change, but definitely another big incident that had occurred. And so then we're seeing what is currently going on, right? Ahmaud Arbery, we've got Christian Cooper, who was the man who was accosted in New York Central Park. Then you have Breonna Taylor, who was murdered in Kentucky, as well as George Floyd, who was in Minneapolis. And then the most recent police shooting that was the man who passed away was 26 or 27 years old. His name was Rashard Brooks in Atlanta, Georgia, which we saw a chief of police step down, because of what was going on. And so that's kind of all of the things that we've seen happening as well as the murder and disappearance of a lot of transgender Black men and women and individuals, as well as there have been several hangings of Black folks that there are investigations being opened on a lot of those deaths as well. So I know that's a lot. It's a lot of information to throw at you. Folks are probably like, holy crap, what are we talking about? But I want to make sure that we're setting you up for success in how this, how we got here and why social responsibility will be so important in having this conversation. A lot of this is stuff that wasn't taught in our history classes. And so I want to make sure that everybody is kind of starting from the same place. So what I want to talk about, and Taylor will assist me with this, is what is social responsibility, right? What does that mean to us? And so what we want to do right now is take a couple of minutes and break folks out into breakout sessions to spend a minute or two talking about what social responsibility means to you. So Taylor, if you could assist me in this and breaking folks out into breakout rooms, that would be great. And then if everybody in your breakout room could identify one person to come back to the large group and drop your thoughts in the chat, that would be awesome. So we will.
All right, I'm going to open the rooms and we will call you back in a few moments.
Thank you, Taylor.
Okay.
Okay, we will give it just a second for folks to join us again. Awesome. Okay, if folks want to take just a second to drop some thoughts in the chat, what did you talk about in regards to social responsibility? What does that look like for you? What does it mean for you? If you want to take a second to summarize your thoughts or your group's thoughts and drop them in the chat. I figured out how to finally see it, so this is helpful. We will give it just a second. I always tell folks I'm really good at silence only because I do conduct. So I am willing to give everybody at least a few more seconds. Thank you, Everett. Thank you, Lawrence. So we've got social responsibility is the moral objection assumed by companies and organizations that support their decision to invest resources in communities in which they work and their employees live. Lawrence shared the obligation to do something, to speak up, and to act. Right? So the ZBT Credo talks about fraternity requires the individual to commit himself and accept his responsibility to participate. And so that's really what we're talking about, of course, when we talk about social responsibility in regards to ZBT. But I think everything that you all have shared is also very accurate. Jared shared a person or group of people that act to better support society and their communities. So absolutely, thank you so much. So what we want to talk about next is ZBT's role in all of this in regards to social responsibility, right? So we've talked about what social responsibility is, but we also can't negate that justice is one of the 6 precepts of the fraternity as well, and how those two intersect. And so thinking about, it is ZBT's role to be a part of this conversation, whether it's at a micro level or a macro level. And we'll talk about the different ways in which you can get involved in both. Also, ZBT does anti-hate education and programming, right? We have a partnership with the National Coalition Building Institute. I think they intentionally made that hard to say. That is about, learning how to talk to people and how to help them shift their perspectives and how to have healthy dialogue around these types of topics. We also do this type of education as well as anti-Semitism education. And so all of those things are really important to who ZBT is. But of course, also the organization is historically Jewish and is inclusively Jewish today. And so being founded on principles of, pursuing justice and repairing the world and, honoring humanity as well as giving. And so all of those things are important to understand that people are people and everybody has great value and that they deserve respect and we should help those who are in need. And right now, the Black community in the United States is in need. And so we want to make sure that we are being really thoughtful about what ZBT says they're about and being able to exhibit those behaviors as well. And so the next thing is really thinking about fighting hate takes active participation. So I love that Lawrence and Jared both use the language act, right? That's a big piece of social responsibility. And so we want to talk a little bit about what is active participation? What does that look like? And I know you all are going to say, Christina, we were just in breakouts, but we're going to send you back to breakouts for a couple of extra minutes to talk about what is active participation. So I'm going to challenge you all to come up with 3 examples of what active participation looks like in regards to fighting hate. So Taylor, if you could send our friends back to breakouts, that would be great. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Again, feel free to mute yourself so we don't have a lot of feedback. But if you don't mind starting to type those little fingers about what is active participation. So 3 things that is active participation in regards to fighting hate. I'll give you all a couple of seconds. Start typing away. Okay. So Farron shared attending protests, educating others, speaking up, encouraging people to vote, donating, learning about others. Everett, he's talked about leading a nonprofit that's creating an equal playing field in education. For the boys of color, those from under-resourced communities and schools to provide what the schools and their parents can't, so they too are advantaged. Todd, teaching critical thinking and decision-making skills. Anthony, doing something outside of your normal life to fight injustice without it being a one-time thing. Protesting and making the voices that need to be heard. I love that. Thank you all. So keep thinking about that. Keep thinking about ways that you can be an active participant, but we will cover some of the things that you all just shared now. So let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about what your chapters can be doing. So first is creating space for healing, processing, and action planning. Let's break those down a little bit. So a healing space really should be for those who have been impacted and those who are empathetic to that impact, right? So sometimes we want to call those folks allies or advocates or whatever that may be, but really the healing should be centered around those who are directly impacted by whatever is going on. So being really thoughtful that when we're creating healing spaces, people who maybe disagree that there's hurt or harm probably shouldn't be invited to those spaces in order to not do further harm and hurt to folks. Thinking about the concept of processing spaces and action planning spaces, really what we're looking at there is, let's talk about what's going on. Like, let's wrap our heads around what's going on, and then let's talk about what we can do, right? What is really important, especially at the chapter level, is that, say, a programming director isn't just like doing a thing because that's how he feels, right? We need to make sure that there is some level of collective consensus within the chapter. Not saying that everybody has to agree on what's going on. However, there should be some sense of, hey, how do folks feel? This is why we're going to do this because this is what ZBT is about. And if you're not really on board, let's talk about that, or let's get you the education that can help you get there. And also let's just have a conversation about who ZBT is and what we were founded on and intended to do. So having those conversations around social responsibility and justice. Next is offering educational programming. I am a huge fan of getting your house in order first. So let's focus at the chapter level about how to do education of our brothers and make sure that everybody kind of has an understanding of where we are. And then as we're able, doing educational programming externally. Now, making sure also that typically the person who is leading whatever that educational program is somewhat of an expert, right? So not Brother Joe, who's just like kind of interested and maybe wants to get up and talk in front of people. Let's talk about the community person, within your campus community or just off of your campus community that can come in and share some true expertise. We want to focus on not doing more harm than has already been done. And so we don't want to put people who have less experience in positions to do those kinds of things. Next would be to connect with other community leaders and their fraternity and sorority advisor. That's what FSA stands for. Just didn't want to write it all the way out, so it messed up my look here. So reach out to your community leaders and fraternity and sorority advisors. What that means is, let's do a grassroots campaign. Let's talk about how we as a community can talk about who we are and the harm that we've potentially done and what we need to do to repair that harm, right? So how are we looking at our Constitution, our bylaws, our policies, and our practices that potentially disenfranchise people from joining our community, or once they get here, pushes them away from being retained? Not only that, let's talk about our recruitment processes, right? That sometimes is really hard for folks because that feels like such an ingrained part of our culture. But how are our recruitment processes, again, being exclusive to people who aren't the majority? Or how are they, existing in a way that people initially join and then they're like, wait, that's not what you told me during recruitment, right? And so making sure that we are creating a space that is inclusive of people. And a good example of that would be, sometimes we will see chapters who want to have a recruitment event, and it's on the 4th floor of a building, and that building is not ADA accessible, right? And we have an individual who wants to come to our event who is in a wheelchair or broke his leg the day before, right? We have to think about how to make our recruitment inclusive of all folks, as well as thinking about how, for example, with ZBT, how do we explain the Jewish identity of the organization to people in a way that helps them understand this is who we are, this is what we expect, and also we accept all men of good character, right? And this is what that looks like. So really thinking about how our recruitment processes, including all of those things. Also finances. This is a weird conversation, but at some point we have to be genuine and upfront about what is expected of them when it comes to the financial burden. It is not fair to not tell Brother Joe, right, that you can do payment plan, not a big deal. And then, a couple months in, you're like, hey, you owe all of this money and we're going to send you to collections. That's not fair. So really thinking about how we're communicating that as well. And then when you're thinking about your community as a whole, what does treatment and inclusion of your cultural based orgs look like? Are you the person who can rattle off IFC and Panhellenic or CPC, and then you struggle to say NPHC because you have, historically Black organizations on your campus, or you struggle to say MGC because you have multicultural groups on your campus? You struggle to know who they are or what their organizations stand for, or even what the names of their organizations are. Let's start there. Let's talk about how we can take care of the people within our community in order to then be externally inclusive. Because a lot of people, again, a lot of it comes down to optics and wanting to seem like we're inclusive and diverse and we're equitable. But really, again, we need to take care of our house on the inside. A lot of folks have become very accustomed to statement culture, which is fine. But that statement has to be followed up with action. And that's something you really have to think about at the community level, is if we're going to write a statement, that's great. And also what action is going to be coupled with it. That isn't just donating money. And we will talk about that more here in a little bit. Another thing that you can do at the chapter level as well within your community is assist in voting efforts, right? It is an election year of our president and those kinds of things. And so making sure that you're assisting in those voting efforts. And even if it's not, hey, we as the Delta Beta chapter are going to do this collectively, but you can also just say, hey, here are the opportunities to get involved in these voting efforts that already exist on our campus or in our community, so you can assist efforts that are already going on. And then lastly, as a chapter, of course, is donating. But again, making sure that everybody's on the same page about what we're doing, why we're donating, who we're donating to, what do they do, making sure that we're really understanding what's going on, as well as encouraging individual brothers to donate too. So feel free to drop questions if you have questions about what chapters can be doing, and I'll make sure to come back to those. But we will also talk now a little bit about what you can do as an individual. So first and foremost is to educate yourself. I can't harp on this really enough. I think a lot of times we get really comfortable with giving money or going to a protest or whatever that may be, but educating yourself first is so incredibly important. Because you must first understand what you're even advocating for, right? It feels somewhat passive and somewhat superficial if you don't actually understand what's going on in the first place. But in that education of yourself is also spreading the wealth of that education, right? So educating others. And we'll talk a little bit about how you do that, but a big piece of kind of this self-work and this journey that you go through when you're thinking about, fighting hate or injustice is reflecting on your past. So I can tell you that is probably one of the hardest parts, to think about the things that you've participated in, said, did, that maybe hurt somebody else, right? That was at a time when you weren't as aware or you were a little bit ignorant to a topic. That is one of the hardest parts, is to genuinely reflect on your past. But it's something that has to be done in order to really make forward progress. So that's another thing that you can be doing. Next is to disrupt and interrupt problematic behavior. So a really good example of this, if you've got a brother or a friend or a family member who tells a really insensitive joke, a really good go-to is to say, what do you mean? Because immediately that says to them, this is not normal. I do not know what you're talking about. And I need for you to explain to me what you mean. And that immediately forces that person to kind of explain the really terrible, horrible, or whatever thing that they just said. They're typically going to fumble and they're going to go, well, you know what I mean, you know what I'm saying. And so that's a really good just way to interrupt what's going on in the immediacy. Another thing that you can do is, tell me more, help me understand kind of what you're saying. You can also explain to them, like, you seem hurt, right? So if somebody made a really racialized comment about someone and it was extremely hateful, something that you can do is say, tell me more about what you're saying. It seems like that's really coming from a place of hurt, and I want to understand. if you have the capacity to talk them through those kinds of things and get an understanding of where they are and then kind of deconstruct what they've said from there, that can be really helpful. We've gotten into this era as people of saying, you can't do that. You can't say that. And that's not helpful, right? I tell folks all the time, I spent 2 whole years doing that to everybody that I knew that said something hateful or did something hateful. And that doesn't help people to learn, right? And so it's easy to tell people to go to Google and educate themselves, but as much as you can engage in conversations in a healthy way to help people express and then unlearn is really a benefit to really the greater society. Next is to see diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything that you do. So diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't a program that you put on in the fall and then a program that you put on in the spring. It really should be a conversation that is ongoing at all times. So thinking about how you're being inclusive or exclusive at a social event. A good example of that would be you're having a dated social event and you're talking about your dates and you're using she, her language or feminine language to talk about who the dates are going to be, not realizing that some folks may date people who are the same sex as them or who have the same gender identity as them or whatever that may be. So seeing those, what feel like really small things, but feel like really big things to marginalized people can be huge. So again, kind of weaving it into the fabric of who you are, who your chapter is a lot more helpful than trying to make it an initiative or a one-off thing. You can vote, of course. Please get registered to vote. If you're not, make sure that you get registered to vote. Make sure that those around you are registered to vote and do that. Lastly is shop at Black-owned businesses. Right now, this is the time to be putting money in the pockets of Black folks who can help propel the movement, the community, whatever that may look like. So for instance, I recently had roofing work done. And what I could have done was sought out, Black-owned businesses in the area to have that roofing work done. Or maybe you're getting your car fixed. If you can find a Black-owned business in your area, that would be great. Maybe you're buying a t-shirt and you can find Black-owned, t-shirt companies. Etsy is a really good option for like having the Black-owned businesses already outlined. A lot of places are doing that. So really thinking about those types of things when you're going to shop and do projects. Again, feel free to drop questions about these things, but we are going to talk about a few others. One of the biggest ones is to listen to people's stories. The power of storytelling is huge, right? I tell folks all the time, you telling somebody to go read a book is great, but a book can be misinterpreted. Hearing people's stories, being able to dialogue with humans is huge. So listen to stories and believe them, right? And remember them, because it's one thing to hear George Floyd's story right now and believe George Floyd's story, but I need you to remember it 6 years from now. I need you to remember it, 10 months from now, whatever that may look like, but making sure that you're engaging in those dialogues and just listening. Don't let the vastness of this conversation discourage you. This work will be an ongoing journey. And I think you have to see it in that way. It is not a sprint. It is 100% a marathon. You will mess up. I mess up. We all mess up. But understand that everything we do is vast. It has a lot of moving parts, a lot of moving pieces. And so sticking in it as much as possible, but also taking care of yourself, giving yourself grace and giving other people around you grace as you move through this type of social responsibility that ZBTs are called to do. Next is understanding uncomfortableness versus capacity. So I always give this example, and it can be kind of funny, but it's really true. So there's a difference between Melissa, or I'll use you as an example. Melissa says something that is maybe kind of problematic, and if it just makes me feel kind of weird inside, like, oh gosh, I don't want to say anything, that's different than me responding and it harming me or her in the process, right? So an example that I use is I went to get my TSA pre-check, right? To be able to get on the airplane early, because that is important to me. And when I went into the TSA pre-check, I had to give the individual my passport. And I used to have straight hair, almost down to my shoulders. And she looked at my passport, looked at me, looked at my passport and said, "I like your straight hair better." And in that moment, I wanted to say to her, "Tell me why. Is it because of like this Eurocentric beauty standard that you have, that my curly hair isn't good enough, right?" Like I wanted to get in this whole conversation with her. But I was worried that if I engaged her in a conversation like that, that I definitely wasn't going to get my TSA pre-check. And likely, law enforcement or security or whomever was going to get involved in the conversation because she wasn't going to like how I approached it. And so that's the difference between, it makes me feel a little weird and maybe I should say something, versus it's going to negatively impact me or those around me in order to do it. So really understanding the difference and interrupting and disrupting things when you just feel uncomfortable, and then taking care of yourself when you don't have the capacity. Okay. Next is protest. Farron and Anthony and a bunch of people said this. This is awesome. Couple of things that I will say about protest is please follow the Black leadership that is leading the protest. Do not be the individual that is looting or writing or defaming things. Please, focus on what is at hand and follow the Black leadership that is leading the protests. That is particularly important, and protect the Black folks that are at the protests as much as you possibly can. Next is sign petitions. There are so many petitions going around, particularly right now for Breonna Taylor, and making sure that we're calling for the police officers in her incident to be arrested. That's an example of a petition to sign, but also call your local officials. And we will have another program about how to call your local officials and how to write to your local officials and those kinds of things. But as much as you can, calling your local officials, but then also Breonna Taylor's case is another great example of calling the Attorney General in Kentucky or calling whomever in Kentucky and asking for XYZ to happen. So those are all options to you as well. And then lastly, of course, as an individual, you too can donate. One thing that I do want to really touch on though is donating cannot be, if you don't hear anything else that I talk about, hear me when I say donating cannot be the only thing that you do. Because here's the truth about donating money. It has become a norm for fraternities to give money and then walk away, right? Throw money at it and move on. It's become a very passive act. Now, don't get me wrong, donating is great, especially if you have the means, but it has to be coupled with the education of yourself or others, as well as action. Active action. I know that seems weird, but there's also passive action, which would be typically what donating would be. So understanding too that there's a big difference between charity, which is like, oh, I gave, $100 that one time and then I never really came back to it, versus philanthropy, which is kind of an ongoing, I'm going to continue to engage and give, versus giving of your time. And likely doing some combination of all three of those things can be extremely helpful. I also will ask that you don't donate just without knowing the cause, right? We talked about that earlier, like understand who you're donating to and understand where their money goes, because that's particularly important. We're gonna offer a resource to everybody who was on the call. We'll follow up with an email about a resource for charity versus philanthropy versus volunteerism. So you can dive more into that with individually or with your chapters. And then honestly, if nothing else, money doesn't change everything. And if it could, it would have already done so, right? So that action and that education is going to be particularly important. And money doesn't cleanse your conscience, right? It really, really, really can. It can be kind of a self-interest, self-pleasing type thing. Literally, pleasure centers are sent off in our brains when we donate. We can potentially get tax deductions. Like I said, it's somewhat passive. So we want to make sure that it is coupled with action. And so if you want to talk more about that or have questions about it, again, feel free to drop your comments, and I'm happy to talk about it more afterward too. Next, and I think we have just a couple more slides, Everett, to your question, is your journey, right? So one of the first things that you can do is own your identity. So have you ever done like a social identity wheel? Have you ever thought about your gender or your race or your ethnicity, or how your age plays into things, or your national origin or your language, whatever that may be. So if you've never heard of a social identity wheel, please feel free to engage in that activity. But first is really kind of coming to terms with your identities, the identities that you think about a lot, the identities that you never have to think about because of the potential privilege that exists there, and really diving deeper into that. Next, of course, understanding power and privilege. It's important to understand your identities first, because you're never really going to get the dynamics of power and privilege if you don't first understand what the concept of social identities is. So again, kind of engaging in education about power and privilege. And then implicit bias being the automatic associations that creep into our mind involuntarily. We don't mean to, but it just happens because of the things we've watched, that we've seen, that we've been taught, that we've been told. All of those things impact our implicit bias. So then doing some education on that. As I mentioned earlier, reflecting on how you've contributed to systems that marginalize people. Exploring the history that you weren't taught, which is some examples of that may have been what we talked about on the front end. And then of course, doing the work about how to disrupt and interrupt behavior that's happening that feels comfortable and that you feel confident in engaging in. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some of the questions that were posed in the registration. So one of the questions was, what can we do as a brotherhood, to help minorities feel more comfortable on campuses, and how can we help on a bigger scale with Black Lives Matter? So hopefully some of that has been answered, but one thing that I do want to talk about, and for everybody here, I hope you join our presentation on relearning how to talk to each other, which is all about language. I want to start with this point in particular about the use of minorities. I always challenge people to use language that is more in line with the experience that Black folks or people of color are having. So underrepresented is an alternative, marginalized, minoritized, is more inclusive than minorities. And part of the reason is because minority literally means inferior. And so in order to kind of deconstruct and kind of tear down this concept of superiority of a race, we really want to move away from that type of language. But hopefully a lot of the things that we have talked about have answered this question, and the, helping on a bigger scale, the protesting, the getting involved, the calling your local officials, voting, interrupting, disrupting behavior as soon as it happens is super important. One thing, and it's an adjacent conversation, but of course, sexual violence is another conversation that we have a lot of the time. And I know that it's intense, but really, I get calls often from young men who are saying, somebody in our chapter or somebody who we know, was sexually assaulted. One of the first things that I ask them is, did you know this individual or this brother exhibited these types of behaviors before? And a lot of times, almost every time, the president will say, yes, he was creepy before, he did this thing before. And that's why we talk about disrupting and interrupting behavior. Because if you allow behavior to be normalized, it gets more and more significant as time goes on. And so what can you be doing? You can be taking care of the really terrible things that are happening in your own space. So really thinking about that. So what can we do right away to make our chapters a safer place for people of color? I think it's going to really start with that education piece, getting a sense of where your entire chapter is, and doing some work to figure out where their internal thoughts are, not just what they speak externally. I think because we've seen a lot in the news and in this, period of time that we're experiencing, that people may externally think one thing and then internally have some implicit biases that are impacting where they're at. We talked a little bit about the bipartisan government, but please feel free to chat a question if you have other questions about that. And then we also talked about uniting their campus, especially during COVID-19 and being dispersed, but finding a way to kind of do that grassroots experience with the other leaders within your community to take action and take a look internally at how you are externally being viewed or how you're negatively impacting your community. I want to share some resources with you all. So feel free to take a picture of this slide. If you are not familiar with the implicit association test that Harvard University does, these are basically based in implicit bias. And so you take a really quick test. You can do it on tons of different topics about gun violence, Black people, women, men, Asian American, whatever it may be. But you can take these tests and it will show you if you have a bias towards one or the other of whatever the topic might be. So I always encourage people to do this because it is fascinating, because even somebody like myself who feels confident to teach on this topic, 100% I am still going to show bias, because again, my implicit bias, the things that I've been taught my entire life, right, is going to creep into my brain. When I hear that the pilot's getting on the plane, I typically just assume he's a man until I see that it's a woman, right? So thinking about those types of things and how those exist. 10 counterproductive behaviors of well-intentioned people. I think everybody in the history of ever needs to read this article. Whether you are light years ahead in diversity, equity, and inclusion, or you are starting, this is an article that you need to read, and it is quick. And I know the human who wrote it. They are a great human, and so I 100% recommend reading it. Blind spot, hidden biases of good people. This is a great 8-chapter book. Quick, talks about implicit bias. The New Jim Crow, if you want to read more about mass incarceration and how we got to where we are today, it's a great book. Me and White Supremacy and White Fragility are exactly what they sound like. So really for, focused on folks who are white and their self-work journey. And then lastly, how to be an anti-racist. A lot of folks think that we're only talking to white people when we have this conversation, but we're not. We're talking really to all non-Black people. So that is other people of color. If you're not familiar with the NYU incident that happened with an Asian fraternity around the really anti-Black racist things that they were saying in their group chats, please look it up. And that was probably just a few weeks back. So really looking at how that shows up, and these are all great resources. And then I have time, maybe a couple minutes for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself, turn on your camera and ask them, or you are more than welcome to drop them in the chat. And again, no question is a bad question, whatever you have questions about. And thank you for all of the sweet notes of great job and highly educational. It's great, thank you. We will give everybody just a couple of seconds to think about it.
I'm trying to, can you hear me?
Yes.
It won't let my camera.
That's okay.
Can start the video. Okay, well, anyhow, my name is Everett Glenn. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and I've been a lawyer for 44 years. You can't see me, so I guess if you have an implicit bias, you'll figure out I'm Black from my voice. But I started my career at Gurn, Merritt, Saug, and Cohen, and I moved on from Gurn, Merritt, Saug, and Cohen to Heller, Ehrman, White, and McAuliffe, and then I moved on to Benish, Friedlander, Copeland, and Arnoff, and I've had more success than I could have hoped or imagined in my professional life. And as the names indicate, I mean, I know lots of Jews, and Wilton Saul, when I went to sit for the bar exam, I was an intern at Gurn, Merritt, Saul, and Cohen, and he said, look, Everett, versus going to the bar review course, I'm just going to work with you one-on-one here at the office, right? Because he actually, the way the bar is set up, individual lawyers write questions and they grade the question that they write, right? And so he said, I'm just going to work with you on writing. Don't worry about the bar. So I passed the bar on the first time in Ohio. And then I moved to California, passed the bar on the first time in California. And so that's why I signed on to this call, is because I have a long and successful career. One of my best friends in life is Jed Margolis. We played on the basketball team at Oberlin together. And I just wanted to offer, money is not the solution to the problem. There's no doubt about that, because if money would fix it, it would have been fixed, because we spent a whole lot of money. But what is part of the problem, I mean, part of the solution, is programs that work. They need funding, programs that work. And what I see all too often, and I use my life as a testament that you can take a black boy out of the inner city with an alcoholic father and a mom who had an 8th grade education, and he could become a Hall of Fame lawyer because people invested in me from the time I was in the 6th grade. Okay, so every summer from 6th grade to 12th grade, I was in an enrichment program. Started out at Oberlin College, then I went to John Carroll University, spent the summer at University School, and 3 years at Case Western Reserve. So when I was in the 12th grade, there wasn't no question in my mind, I was smarter than most of the people, and I had never met a white person until I got to high school, because I was in an all-black neighborhood, and so I didn't feel confident. But my lack of confidence came more from the fact that I came from a poor family, and so I was ashamed of that. But I wasn't ashamed of who I was as a person. And so I'm going to, like a university school with the guy, Dale Spitzer, who owns all the car dealerships in Ohio, and my dad worked at the factory, right? Make, minimum wage. So if we could solve this problem, education is the antidote. Education. I get stopped by the police. I don't worry about the police. The police are not my problem. The police are not black people's problem. The problem is we got a lot of folk running around here. The family has been destroyed, and that was intentional. And so the family, you work down from the family to the kids. And even like the situation the other day in Atlanta, now that guy shouldn't have died for sure, because all he did was sleep in his car and he was drunk. He shouldn't be dead, but he shouldn't be sleeping in his car drunk either. Okay. And if we can put the right kind of stuff in these boys when they're young, we can solve most of these problems that we have. And I don't know why. And we cut all of these programs. It took me from nothing to where I could support 110 boys myself. They cut all those programs. And now they give money to the Boys and Girls Club. And the Boys and Girls Club is wonderful, but they don't take a kid from 6th grade to 12th grade and change his life. That's more like a latchkey, you stay here, it's a safe zone for the couple hours after school before mom gets home. But they're not teaching guys how to critically think and how to reason and how to become a man. They're not teaching that at the Boys and Girls Club. In fact, we work with kids who play sports, and we're turning them into leaders. And kids who play sports, they don't go to Boys and Girls Club, right? Because they have sports to take up the time, so they don't have to just be babysit, sort of like. So I think if we can, and we have a program. We have a program. It's called BOSS. It's the Business of Student Success, and we've been doing it for 5 years. And we get in Long Beach, in Southern California, although it's headquartered at Long Beach State, we get kids from beyond Long Beach. But in Long Beach, 75% of the black and brown boys graduate from high school today, and they can't even apply to college. And Long Beach is a blue ribbon school district. Do you hear me? A blue ribbon school district has a 75% failure rate. We take those same boys, and in 3 years, we got 110 boys. They outperform all the boys in the district and everything that the district tracks. Okay, everything, because we showed them, we putting in them the principles and the philosophies of greatness, the same principles that corporate leaders have used to become corporate leaders. So they know Jim Collins, they know Robert Kawasaki, they know all of these guys. They know these principles. It's because the principles are universal. Jim Collins don't have a license on how to get from good to great. Okay, so we can show these boys how to get from good to great using the same principles Jim Collins uses to tell business owners how to take your business from good to great. I just wanted to share that, so I'm glad to be on here, and we have a solution. We have a solution.
Well, and Ever, if you wouldn't mind, if you could drop some information about the BOSS program just so we could read about it, I think that would be great. So if you could drop maybe a link in the chat function, that would be Right? And I'd love to open it up for other folks who maybe have questions or comments or concerns that they would like to talk through. Anybody else in the group? Okay. All right. Well, if anybody would like to connect after this call, I will go ahead and drop my email for those of you who don't already talk to on a regular basis. Please feel free to connect with me. And I really, really, really appreciate everybody taking an hour out of your Tuesday evening. And we are wrapping up. So thank you all and have a good evening.